There are some folks today who are being a little bit more honest about what it would take to really get to the gun-free utopia they want. And that, of course, is repeal of the Second Amendment. So Barry Weiss, a reporter, a staff writer over at the New York Times, who was ripped earlier this week, we talked about her, she was ripped earlier this week for being supposedly too conservative, for saying that immigrants get the job done after she tweeted that about the daughter of immigrants rather than immigrants themselves, and she was ripped up and down by members of the New York Times staff. Well, she tweeted out repeal the Second Amendment, and then she tweeted out a column that was written by Bret Stephens a year ago in October of 2017, or a few months ago in October 2017, after the Las Vegas shooting, I believe. And that column was titled Repeal the Second Amendment. So let's go through that column because it's about as good an argument as you will hear for repealing the Second Amendment, and it is not a very good argument at that. So Bret Stephens starts off that column by deriding what he calls the conservative fetish for the Second Amendment. So why exactly would conservatives support a private right to own weapons for the protection of life and liberty? After all, Stephens says, quote, from a law and order standpoint, more guns mean more murder. Now, this actually is not true. Okay, more guns in certain places mean more murder. More guns in Vermont do not mean more murder. More guns in rural Texas do not necessarily mean more murder. Stephens cites a study in the American Journal of Public Health from 2013 to show that, quote, states with higher rates of gun ownership had disproportionately large numbers of deaths from firearm-related homicides. But there's only one problem with the study. This examines the statistics on a state level, which doesn't make any sense, given that virtually all murder in the United States takes place not in rural areas of states, but in the big cities. And in those big cities, there are very harsh gun laws. In the big cities, that's where nearly all murder in the United States takes place, in big cities. So there's very little link, actually, between state law and state homicide rate, as Eugene Volokh of the Washington Post pointed out. Beyond that, that same study that he's citing that says that states with higher rates of gun ownership had disproportionately large numbers of deaths from firearm-related homicide, there's one problem with the study. The single largest variable when it comes to murder rate is not actually gun ownership in these various states. The single largest rate, which the study tries to bury, the single largest problem is that the highest correlation is between the number of black people in a particular state and the number of homicides. This is not a racist point. Okay, people are not murdering other people because they are black. That's obviously a stupid notion. But if you're going to look at what is statistically relevant, and you're going to look at factors that are statistically relevant, the number of black people in a state are more statistically relevant than the number of guns in a state. Right? This is according to the study. Quote, for each one standard deviation increase in proportion of household gun ownership, firearm homicide rate increased by 12.9%. For each one standard deviation increase in proportion of black population, firearm homicide rate increased by 82.8%. The study tried to bury that data by not showing it in the actual text of the study. So if you love that study so much, then you should recognize that there are variables that have significantly more impact than gun ownership rate. And that has to do, and we can talk about why there's a higher homicide rate in the black community than there is in the white community. A lot of it has to do with under-policing the black community that has been a matter of systemic discrimination since the 1800s, where white communities basically said to black communities, fend for yourselves, and that's been inculcated in particular areas of the culture. But that's not the point. The point that I'm making is that if you are going to suggest that gun ownership is highly correlative with gun death, then you have to look at other factors that are highly correlative with gun death and see that these statistics are not nearly as significant as you think they are. Stephens continues by stating, quote, from a personal safety standpoint, more guns means less safety. He then cites the fact that more people are killed every year in accidental firearm death than in self-defense shooting situations. But that's not a proper statistic either, because the times that people use a gun in self-defense far exceed the number of times you actually shoot somebody to death in self-defense. The goal of having a gun in your home is so that you can pull it out. I mean, I know there's a woman around the corner, and she was at home, and there's a guy who tried to break into her house. She went and got the shotgun from the back room. Well, rather, she screamed. The guy ran away. The police came. They told her, what you should do next time that happens is, do you have a gun in the house? She said, yes. They said, go get your pump-action shotgun and then cock the shotgun, right? Give it do that near the door, and the guy will run. You won't have a problem. Now, that would not show up in any of the statistics that are being measured by the CDC. It would not show up as a use of a gun in self-defense because you didn't actually point it at somebody, you didn't actually shoot somebody, you didn't actually wound somebody. But this sort of stuff happens all the time. And there's a widely varying set of statistics on how often people use guns in self-defense this way. According to the National Self-Defense Survey extrapolations, people use firearms in self-defense millions of times a year. That may be too high. Brian Doherty at Reason has an exhaustive analysis of whether it's hundreds of thousands of times a year or millions of times a year, but it's certainly not 268 justifiable homicide by firearms. Right? That is not the full measure of the number of times people actually use guns in self-defense in the United States. So Stephen then moves on to deriding the philosophy of gun ownership. He says that The idea that we can protect liberty by having guns in the United States, that we can protect from foreign threat by having guns in the United States is a quaint idea. Well, I wonder if it's such a quaint idea after Afghanistan, after Vietnam. The fact is that small arms gun ownership and guerrilla warfare have been successful at thwarting some of the greatest powers in the history of humanity. The United States in Afghanistan and Vietnam, and the Russians in Afghanistan, for example. Those have been thwarted by IEDs and small guns. Right? These are not being thwarted by necessarily top-level military weaponry. Finally, he goes on and he says that the idea that an armed citizenry is the ultimate check on the ambitions and encroachment of government power is silly. And then he says, well, look at the Whiskey Rebellion. That wasn't a government check on a check on government power, except that it sort of was. The Whiskey Rebellion, which happened in the late 1790s, it was directed at an internal whiskey tax placed by the federal government. There are a bunch of people who grew corn for whiskey, and they were very upset that the whiskey tax was affecting them, and there was an armed revolt, and it was put down with violence. A couple of people were hung in it. And so he says, well, that showed that there was a failure of armed insurrection, except for the fact, of course, that President John Adams may have lost the presidency in 1800 based on that, and that President Thomas Jefferson then immediately went about revoking the whiskey tax. So it obviously had a pretty significant political impact. In fact, you can even look at today. Right? There's a big hubbub over Clive Bundy. You remember this. There was nearly an armed standoff with the federal government over Clive Bundy's territory, where Clive Bundy wanted to feed his cattle on land that he historically grazed cattle on, and the Environmental Protection Association, the EPA agency, rather, they came in and they said that this was terrible, that he couldn't be grazing his cattle on this area, and they tried to fine him, then they tried to seize his farm. And Clive Bundy refused to go along with the arrest, and a bunch of people showed up and refused to go along with the arrest as well. Well, there was just a jury nullification that happened, and Clive Bundy went free. The Bundy family went free. And now there's been a major political push in the United States to get the EPA out of the business of regulating so much land. So, yes, armed insurrection is not always worthwhile. Sometimes it's terrible. The Civil War was a terrible, terrible thing. But the idea that having lots of people with guns does not somehow check the ambitions of the federal government is obviously nonsensical. The reason that we're not really talking in serious terms about full-scale gun confiscation is because you try that crap in Texas, it ain't going to go well. Stevens then turns to the active shooter phenomenon. He says that such situations are extremely rare in the rest of the world, which is true. It is also true that they are extremely rare here in the United States as well. So John Lott's website, the Crime Prevention Research Center, he goes through the annual death rate from mass public shootings, comparing the European countries to US and Canada, and he did it on a per capita basis. So one of the things that happens is that the United States is compared to Britain, for example. You say, oh, there are lots more shootings here than there are in Britain. Right, we're a much larger country than Britain. When you actually look at the death rate per million people from mass public shootings from 2009 through 2015, according to the Crime Prevention Research Center, the #1 country was Norway because they had that horrible Andres Breivik shooting. And then it's Serbia, France, Macedonia, Albania, Slovakia, Switzerland, Finland, Belgium, Czech Republic, and then the United States. How about frequency? Right, forget about the number of dead. How about frequency of mass public shootings? So if you look at the frequency of mass public shootings from January 2009 to December 2015 per million people, in order, it's Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Switzerland, Norway, Slovakia, Finland, Belgium, Austria, Czech Republic, France, and then the United States. The average incident rate for 28 EU countries is 0.0602 with a 95% confidence interval of 0.0257 to 0.09477. The US rate is 0.078 higher than the EU rate, but the US and average for EU countries are not statistically different. In other words, we're having about the same number of mass shootings as are happening in other countries, and we have significantly more guns. So this idea that everything lines up is just not statistically correct. Again, the case for full-scale gun confiscation is particularly weak, especially in a country where you have, as I say, some 300 million guns and 100 million gun owners. Finally, he says that leftists are losing the gun control debate when they lie about the facts, which is true, and that they should stop talking about quote-unquote common-sense gun control, and they should just repeal the Second Amendment. He says gun ownership shouldn't be outlawed. It doesn't need a blanket constitutional protection either. Right? It never occurs to Stevens that the fundamental argument in favor of owning a gun is protection of life, which is the fundamental right that you have in a state of nature, according to both the Founding Fathers and John Locke, and that the reason you have a gun is to protect your own life and protect your own liberty, and a state powerful enough to confiscate weaponry on a grand scale is a state powerful enough to end your rights as well. Other rights, not just your First Amendment rights. And Stevens finishes by saying, the true foundation of American exceptionalism should be our capacity for moral and constitutional renewal, not our instinct for self-destruction. But that's not true at all. The true foundation of American exceptionalism is the idea that we built a system on unchanging human nature. Human nature has not changed. And the idea of handing a complete monopoly on gun ownership over to the federal government is a scary one, or should be a scary one, to anyone who loves liberty. Okay, when we continue here in just a second, I want to talk about the NRA, because the left is going nuts over the NRA. So let's talk about that. Okay, let's begin with Nancy Pelosi. So Nancy Pelosi, of course, has decided that the NRA is fully corrupt and that they are the ones deciding America's character. Here is the House Minority Leader.
Whose political survival in this body is more important than the survival of our children, for example? Most recently yesterday, Sandy Hook, for example, or on the streets of our cities. Who of us in here is more important? Whose political survival is more important than that? Nobody's. Nobody's. So we have to be bold. We have to go forward, and we cannot let the National Rifle Association and its many, however they get their money, and that's another subject, to decide what the character of America is.
You know, this sort of kabuki theater in which the Democrats participate is quite gross. They did control the Congress with 60 votes in the Senate, as well as a majority in the House and the presidency from 2009 to 2011. And here is the grand total number of major gun legislation pieces they passed. 0. Okay, the answer is 0. This is what Democrats always do. They don't want to touch these issues because they think they're political winners. Instead, they wish them to fester. If Democrats really thought that gun confiscation were a thing, they could have moved in favor of it in 2010, in 2009, in 2008. They didn't do any of those things. Instead, they sat around and waited for Republicans to take office again, and then they rail against the Republicans supposedly being in the pay of the NRA. They did the same thing with illegal immigration. We'll get to that in a little while. Democrats have been saying that illegal immigration, DACA, deeply important things. They didn't do anything on illegal immigration while they had control, and now that Republicans have control, they're railing against Republicans. This is the game they play.